I'm one of the other directors of studies in history alongside Dr. Reed. There are 3 of us in total, and 2 of us are giving you these talks. Just to introduce myself a little bit, I'm at the history faculty where I'm a reader in modern European history, and I teach on the long 18th century, predominantly in Europe, but also with an interest in the colonies as well. And one of my particular areas of research is the French Revolution, and another is the history of food. So what you're about to hear comes from those 2 interests at a moment when I thought I would bring them together in some interesting ways and tell you a bit about the butchers of the Revolution. So let's move into the talk itself. Just a moment. What's the first thing that anyone learns about the French Revolution? And usually, of course, when I give this talk, I give it in among an audience so I can see people waving their arms about. But very often what you read about the French Revolution, or what you'll have been taught about the French Revolution, is that it was a political event that was driven by hunger among the French population. To give you an example of how this claim continues, according to a 2010 article in the Smithsonian magazine, the revolution features among the landmark food-related moments in history. Although research on the revolutionaries themselves has shown that those who assumed power probably lacked much personal experience of hunger, the causal connection continues to be made in both popular and scholarly accounts of the revolution. But on the other hand, food riots were something that had been common to the old regime from about 1709 onwards. And as an historian, one might well ask why it took all of 80 years before French subjects came to see the appropriate response to a food crisis as being the overthrow of the reigning monarch and the dismantling of an entire social order. So, for example, here we have a causal explanation that links hunger to revolution in ways that doesn't really tell us why hunger caused a different outcome in 1789 than it ever had before, nor why it led to political change as opposed to an increase, say, in charitable relief. Nor does it explain why the response in France diverged from that elsewhere in Europe, because harvest failures that led to food shortages occurred around Europe during the 1780s. In my research, I could find at least 10 different countries where there were food shortages as a result of crop failures in the later 1780s. But only in France do you get a revolution with a capital R. And yet, enormous amounts of interpretation have been built upon that claim. The revolution has been hailed as the creation of modern political culture and as a foretaste of modern democracy. It should be pointed out, I think, at this moment that actually this marshalling of hunger to explain the events of the revolution is not new. It actually dates back to the revolution itself. And it was consecrated in a variety of very famous histories after the event, such as the histories written by Jules Michelet or Hippolyte Taine, both famous 19th century French historians. So I think it's fair to say that food bears a very heavy explanatory burden in accounts of the French Revolution. But for a long time, historians only looked at the history of food in the 18th century in terms of things like food prices and commerce. They paid very little attention to conversations over food that took place between publics and politicians. Now, the purpose of this talk is not to deny the reality of hunger in France, either before, during, or after 1789. Rather, what I want to do today is to explore some of the ways in which eating and drinking featured in revolutionary debate, both literally and figuratively. Because at this time, food, and certainly some foods in particular, took on an explanatory role that extended well beyond ordinary understandings of need and consumption, as we'll see. And one of the things historians have assumed that has been incredibly problematic is that all those who rioted or all those who participated in the revolution were compelled by irresistible biological urges, that they didn't at some level have any power to interpret what it was they were going through, that they simply responded to food shortages by overturning the government. Instead, what we can see is that for all of the groups caught up in the revolution, whether they were the politicians themselves, the ordinary people, the victims of the revolution, the supporters of the revolution or its opponents, discussions about eating and drinking, which are obviously things that are central to everyday life, became invested with new sorts of political meaning. And in the process of so doing, they became moralized and politicized in ways that still affect us today. An absence of food was seen as a core legitimation for overthrowing the old regime. Taking control of the food supply accordingly became a priority for each of the political regimes that succeeded one another between 1789 and 1799. And this includes the first phase of the revolution in which the monarch was still in control of events. The main concern that regimes had was that they should be seen to manage the food supply better and more effectively than the previous administration. As the government officials who shaped French food policy through the 1790s would discover, finding out what counted as a true need and allocating food resources among the population was simply no easy task. And so you get a great deal of disagreement between different factions over what counted as an adequate diet, over what different kinds of foodstuffs meant or should mean to revolutionary eaters. So we'll be looking at some of these issues as we go over the period of the revolutionary decade. So let's start with the way in which in school textbooks, that some of which you've probably come across, in many popular histories and in newspapers, the French Revolution tends to be portrayed in two very specific ways where food is concerned. First of all, it's seen as literally provoked by hunger. It's argued in these sorts of sources that appetites in the body of the population are implicitly enough to explain why radical social change and political change occurred. Secondly, another theme that comes out of writing on the revolution in regard to food is cannibalism. Quite often the French are seen as an entire population consuming themselves. And you get words like bloodthirsty or butchers and cannibalistic imagery generically applied to famous events of the French Revolution, such as the Terror and the prison massacres of September 1792, or the guillotining of the monarch in January 1793. And to give you just one very recent example, I want to cite from an article in the New Yorker magazine, which describes Robespierre and his group as, quote, revolutionary butchers, but they were butchers surrounded by vampires, which I think kind of doubles down on the kind of bloodthirsty imagery here. So since the 1790s, it's fair to say the French Revolution has been written in the language of meat. And these figures echo through the historiography from the very first event that is taken usually to mark the start of the revolution. And I'm quoting here from a source of 1790. After storming the Bastille, the crowd killed the prison's governor, the Marquis de Launay, and a butcher named Desnos cut off his head with a pocket knife. Now, cutting off a human head is no easy task, as anyone who's ever attempted it will know, and I'm hoping none of you out there have ever attempted such a feat, and particularly trying to cut it off with a pocket knife is not exactly the easiest way to go about it. So when the 33-year-old François Félix Desnos confessed to his role in the death of the Marquis de Launay in January 1790, he in fact declared himself to be a cook not a butcher. He'd been jobless since July 1789 and dependent on his seamstress wife. He hadn't himself, in fact, killed Delaunay, but he was given a sabre to cut off the dead man's head, and he struggled with this enormous and unwieldy implement, so he drew out a knife with a black handle from his pocket and finished off the operation. The head, thus separated from the body, was placed on the end of a pikestaff. Strangely enough, Desnos was again on the scene when Berthier de Sauvigny, the royal governor of Paris, was murdered 8 days later by a furious soldier, after which someone had torn out Monsieur Berthier's heart and put it into Desnos' hand. Desnos then, in company with the soldier, proceeded to the town hall to listen to Lafayette giving a speech, and then, with the heart spitted on the soldier's sabre, the two men walked through Paris along the streets to the Palais Royal. And then they went into a nearby cabaret, which is like a sort of little restaurant, with the soldier. They had a meal in peace and quiet, in the course of which a crowd appeared outside the window of the little cabaret, and Desnos and the soldier tossed the heart of Berthier de Sauvigny, the royal governor of Paris, out of the window. And he said in his report to the police, he had no idea what had become of it after that. Now, I think there's some things we should raise about this kind of processing of these bodies of the early victims of revolutionary violence. First of all, it's clear that the revolutionaries on the streets had quite a long period of contact with the bodies of these royal authority figures. They also must have possessed butchery skills. For example, removal of the heart is quite a complex process. It would have had to involve removing other organs first, or else an instrument capable of opening up the rib cage. So Desnos' interrogators at Paris's main police court initially doubted that he could possibly have decapitated Delaunay with such a small and weak instrument, to which he responded that, quote, thanks to his work as a cook, he knew how to work with meat. Ever since 1790, accounts of this episode have identified Desnos as a butcher, reflecting the shock value of someone skilled in the handling of meat for nourishment, turning to the dismemberment of a human body, and not just any body, but a figure of royal authority. At one level, the conversion of Delaunay and Berthier's bodies into meat recast them specifically in their guise as representatives of royal power, as potential food. And this is a very clear juxtaposition when we think of Desnos' leisurely dinner with the intendant's butchered heart ready to hand. In fact, the dispassionate quality of Desnos' narration of his own actions is very striking. To his interrogators, he replied that he wanted no reward, that he had acted out of patriotism and in hopes of a medal, and that he was not short of food, which I think is the first pointer on the way to what I was saying earlier about how explaining this in terms of hunger is not really enough. Now, the misidentification of Desnos as a butcher in the historiography is more than mere sensationalism. Both real and figurative butchers regularly appeared in the annals of revolutionary events. Let's give some background on butchers first. They are among the wealthier city merchants, and in the 1780s, they inhabited an increasingly articulate and politically engaged artisanal stratum of French society. You may have come across Olympe de Gouges, who wrote a feminist treatise, a feminist version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. She was the daughter of a butcher, so her education that allowed her to write at such a level was because her parents were wealthy. The Paris butcher Louis Legendre rose to become first a deputy for the Département of the Seine, and later on he went on to become president of the National Convention. So the appellation butcher hovered somewhere between a respected urban trade and a metaphor for animal excesses of violence. In revolutionary language and imagery, butchers appeared as symbols of socially sanctioned bloodshed coupled with skill. or else they appeared as commoners who still had access to life-sustaining resources to meat of the sort that otherwise you would only find on the plates of the nobility. During the early Republic, the term butcher was often bestowed, even in a positive sense, upon people who were involved in executing revolutionary justice. There are two examples here who are both generals who were dispatched to quell the Vendée uprising in year 2. And the Vendée uprising was basically a form of civil war in which the central and southern parts of France rose up against the revolution itself, and troops were sent in order to restore peace to the area. Among them was Duquesnoy, the self-titled butcher of the Convention, and Westermann, the butcher of the Vendée. And these titles were often bestowed as a way of signifying that what was going on with the killing of French people who were revolting against the revolution itself was a kind of needful killing, and it served the common good. But counter-revolutionaries also used the term, and they often figured the entire revolution as an act of horrible butchery that had gone wrong. And the term continues to be used in connection with the revolution's more violent episodes. So to give an example that you might have come across, according to Wikipedia for Schools, during the September massacres, the Paris Commune sent gangs into the prisons to try arbitrarily and butcher 1,400 victims, and addressed a circular letter to the other cities of France inviting them to follow this example. References to butchers by the opposition undermined not only deputies' moral character, but also their political legitimacy. The title casts them as bloodthirsty monsters, but also as tradesmen who were unfit for high governmental office. When Earl John Russell, the British Prime Minister, sought in 1833 to explain where the old regime had gone wrong, one of his telling examples was the fact that Louis XV, the king, had stooped to sexual relations with a butcher's daughter, Madame de Pompadour. So, in other words, meat eating in general and butchery in particular were ambiguous practices throughout this period, and nowhere more so than in the political domain. In the 2 decades before the revolution, an expanding French vegetarian movement had amplified claims that meat eaters were inured to pity and incapable of compassion towards their fellow human beings. These associations of meat eating with moral deadness led some revolutionaries themselves to trial a vegetarian diet. So when one contemporary noted that a savage brought to Paris would admire nothing so much as butcher's roe, this was not intended as a compliment to Parisians. One reason why patriotism slipped so readily into literal butchery after 1789 was that the figure of nourishment was threaded through political discourse before, during, and after the revolution. In accounts of events, revolutionary protagonists would but turn by turn addressed as providers and as sources of nourishment. And this is most clearly apparent if we turn from Denot to the king himself. There's evidence that when it came to food, Parisian crowds shared the same understanding of the monarch's role as their English counterparts, a view termed by the British Marxist historian E.P. Thompson the moral economy. In moral economic politics, the king's key role was as provider for his people. Even before Louis XVI had ascended the throne, his nourishing tendencies were portrayed in just such terms by images of him at the ploughshare. I can't remember whether, yes. Crown administrators kept close tabs on the national flour and bread supply throughout the 18th century, imposing price caps at times of dearth. But Louis's reign was marked from the start by experimentation with alternative policies. For example, he oversaw the liberalization of the grain trade, and this was justified on the grounds that monarchical intervention actually harmed the natural stabilization processes of the food supply. Economic laws that were apparent only to scientific minds, according to contemporary commentators, would ensure that resources always reach those areas of the country at greatest need. So intervention in theory was not necessary. The king and many noble reformers took an interest in agricultural improvers and chemists who promised to enhance the national food supply. Old regime ministers with his backing lent financial and institutional support to such programs. But these sorts of ardent efforts could not shore up the king's reputation during the revolution. After the royal family's abortive flight to Varennes in 1791, caricaturists flocked to portray them as pigs, animals at once humanoid and edible. Many images, like that one that I have reproduced here, particularly stressed the king's personal gluttony. In fact, they seem to convey the notion that beneath his nurturing mask, the king was no more than a greedy pig. And if kings were greedy pigs, revolutionaries would be their butchers. Now, the pig has greater political significance here than it might appear. Pork was a meat that was only found on the tables of the poor. Although the identity of the semi-literate artists who produced these series of images is largely unknown, nevertheless, we can determine a sort of political narrative out of the series of caricatures produced in this period, namely that the king could be seen as food for the population. And so this means that these kinds of caricatures are actually a very useful way to understand how these kinds of artists, who were much at the lower end of the social scale, were able to intervene in political discourse. Once the king had been guillotined on the 21st of January 1793, representations of his nourishing role moved from comic to much more sinister. So in a widely distributed image, a very striking image indeed, the king appeared now as a mere severed head, and the caption suggests that the royal blood was to fertilize the nation's soil. In other words, so far from promoting agricultural improvement, the king's body itself was now to be recycled as nourishment for the people. A gory scene was reported to have transpired at the king's execution when those present were purposely sprayed with the blood of a tyrant after the manner of holy water. A media-savvy witness to this scene cried out, apparently, "Friends, what are we doing? This will all be reported. We'll be depicted internationally as a ferocious and bloodthirsty people." Someone replied, "Yes, thirsting for the blood of a despot. Let them report that worldwide if they want." As predicted, the émigré royalist Alexandre du Tilly vividly described these, quote, flows of blood poured with cannibal barbarity to English high society. So he's kind of traveling around these, sitting rooms and basically talking about the experiences of the bloodthirsty revolutionaries that he's escaped. And whether such events were true or not, this is a question that would divide royalists and republicans for many decades. It was clear that the dialogue between ruler and population was now being written in blood, mediated by the printing press and structured by the figure of eating and drinking. Cannibalistic themes also resonated among opponents of the revolution. For example, in the wake of the September massacres, the English caricaturist James Gilray portrayed the sans-culottes gorging themselves on human flesh. This is, of course, a very famous caricature. For anti-Jacobins, both in England and in France, the revolutionary crowd seemed driven by a hunger beyond the bounds of need, reason, or comprehension. At the king's trial, one deputy, Alexandre Delaire, saw very clearly the horns of the Republican dilemma. "If you sacrifice Louis," he said, "you'll have countless enemies abroad, but if you keep him alive, how many more enemies at home? Extended starvation under monarchical rule claimed Delaire, might well have altered the blood of the people so as to turn them into ravening and carnivorous beasts, devoid of the capacity for political judgment. If Louis were to be kept alive, he went on, once the people has devoured the remains of the prey we seem to be saving for their fury, they'll end up devouring each other, not differentiating friends from enemies. So the ultimate end of the revolution was to devour itself. This motif of the bloodthirsty, carnivorous political actor recurred time and time again. It was used with particular effectiveness against the Montagnards, the radical wing of the National Convention. For example, Robespierre's close associate, Georges Couthon, complained that journalists said, after I defended the interests of the people particularly energetically one day, that I needed a glass of blood to refresh myself, I who am afraid of blood and repelled by the sight of a dead body, really, people who are murderous are accusing us of being blood drinkers? After the fall of Robespierre, a pamphlet appeared advertising a leopard barrière for sale for 150,987,617 francs. Barrère was one of the deputies who'd been a supporter of Robespierre, and this pamphlet caricatured him by describing him as a leopard. Despite an externally sociable manner, he possessed, said the caricaturist, a character of ferocity, cruelty, atrocity through weakness, although, quote, he hasn't yet been seen to eat human flesh. In January 1795, motion were passed against Jacobin terrorists and blood drinkers at a cafe in Paris, while at another cafe someone was arrested as a Jacobin blood drinker. The revolution's opponents forged links between democratic political action and mindless savagery. Yet, interestingly, nearly identical imagery was being mobilized by the supporters of the revolution to legitimate the grievances provoking revolutionary violence. The king, ministers, nobles, and tax farmers were frequently depicted feeding on the body and blood of the nation. So here, for example, is one caricature that shows the aristocratic Hydra, and the caption reads that this is a beast that has a ferocious and barbarous and bloodthirsty nature. It feeds only on the blood, tears, and subsistence of the unhappy people. At the king's trial, the deputy François Antoine declared that the monarch allowed the purest of men's blood to be sucked by horrible vampires. Louis deserves to die. And in the view of the editor of one of the main political newspapers, the Moniteur, in year 4, crown officials had grown fat on the flesh of the peoples and weakened them with forced labor, taxation, misery, and hunger. That troop of contractors, quenching its thirst in the shadows upon the blood of human victims, trembled with rage. Ironically, it was a real butcher, Louis Legendre, who was president of the National Convention, oversaw the trial of the butcher of Nantes, Jacques Carrier, so named for his role in the deaths of counter-revolutionaries, 132 of them killed literally inside the town's butchery. A 1795 account of these inglorious episodes from the Vendée uprising framed Carrier and his agents as cannibals moved by, quote, the instinct of a tiger. Yet Carrier himself had resorted to the language of cannibalism in a pamphlet published the previous year by order of the convention, which had dispatched him to handle the uprising. In this pamphlet, he accused the Vendée rebels in exactly the same language. According to him, they were fanatical tigers and cannibals who would cut body parts of loyal Republicans before throwing them into their black dungeons. So with such linguistic convergence characterizing the debate over sovereignty and violence in government, it was increasingly difficult for ordinary readers to distinguish the good guys from the bad. Who should eat whom? Clearly, themes of eating and drinking extend far more deeply into French political culture than just the basic question of filling the empty bellies of the poor. Good and legitimate governance was marked by right eating practice, but the French disagreed fundamentally over what those were. It happened that the Englishwoman Charlotte West and her friend and husband were in Chalon-sur-Marne when the royal family passed through on their humiliatingly public return to Paris after the flight to Varennes in 1791. And here's a picture that shows Louis XVI dressed as a cook in hopes of escaping scrutiny on their flight with his family. Charlotte West and her friend waited upon the Queen, who you can see in the centre there, Marie Antoinette, and the royal children who were under guard. Later on, West watched troops coming through the town en route to and from the besieged frontier. The town being short of food, she noted an important difference between British and French eaters. Potatoes, she said, was a vegetable very little known and less used by the French. Although she and her family used potatoes wherever possible, she says, my French servants would not eat them and asked me if I took them for pigs. But pigs or not, they were obliged to eat them at that time or go without anything in the shape of bread. Revolutionary shortages brought lurking worries about the relationship between food production and consumption to the fore in public debate, and they also exacerbated concerns about the ability of the ruling authority, whoever it might be, to help support the food supply. And often these took the form of concerns about particular iconic foods. One of the things that is worth noting at this point is that government attempts to solve the food supply problem proved very much less than successful. Although many regimes came in on a platform of being able to solve the food supply problems experienced during the old regime, almost all of them failed in one way or another. Problems with the food supply continued for nearly a decade. So it's safe to say that the main way that most people experienced the French Revolution was as a time of hunger and shortage, with foods frequently lacking in the shops. And in fact, ironically, the attempts to replace the Crown administration with a new centralized and rationalized system of food production and trade, so far from ending hunger, would in fact exacerbate the supply crisis around France, affecting even the capital, which normally had a plentiful supply of a wide range of different foods. The National Assembly began in 1789 with the view that liberalizing the grain trade would immediately allow the supply and demand for foods to balance naturally. But by 1793, after 2.5 years of this policy, the situation looked, if anything, even worse than it had in 1790. Ordinary people were marching in the streets for bread and raiding grocers' shops for coffee and sugar. The following year, the newly founded Committee of Public Safety reverted to a paternalistic policy similar to that used in the monarchical era, and they implemented a price cap on bread and other goods, which was known as the general maximum. In the political debate before 1794, bread remained the paramount foodstuff. At least in Paris, a daily supply of white wheaten bread was the sign for the city's poor that society was functioning as it should. As one advisor warned the Committee of Public Safety, bread was an electric spark in popular crises. Some radical Jacobins interpreted this as requiring enforced wheat cultivation on all areas of cultivatable land, and they even sent to the scaffold landowners found to have replaced wheat with other sorts of crops. Others of the Republicans, however, radically reappraised the very definition of dietary needs. And they worried that government programs to provide bread to the entire country would merely turn new groups of consumers who were used to entirely other sorts of staple foods into people who now needed to eat white bread. So the worry was that one might create needs where before there were none. Many trials were conducted on various bread substitutes, substances like rice, potatoes, nuts, and even acorns, all of which was seen as potential foodstuffs for the virtuous Republican. The deputy Jacques-Michel Coupet harangued the National Convention for a return to primitive Gallic existence characterized by sobriety and frugality, and he exhorted cultivators to make use of local resources like beech mast or acorns to replace olive oil. In his view, and that of some other radicals, good Republicans ought to prioritize foods that nature herself had provided to the territory of France. Jacobin disagreements over how to support the food supply actually reflected enduring public suspicion over official attempts to provide substitutes for bread, even though some of those substitutes were familiar staples in other European cultures, as Charlotte West's remarks indicate. The potato was a very contentious vegetable in France. It was rejected by many old regime French consumers. During the Republic's most radical phase in 1793 to 1794, it was this humble tuber nevertheless that would be taken up by authorities as, and I quote here, one of the greatest presents of nature and the food of the free man. By 1796, there were no less than 5 nationally funded potato mills in operation around France, converting millions of potatoes to dried product for year-round use. The retreat from radicalism during the Directory period and beyond, however, correlated with a retreat from this sort of dietary idealism. For example, one deputy, Antoine-François Fourcroy, had been a member of the Committee of Public Safety, but in the wake of the discredit of Robespierre and the retreat from extremism in French government, he sought to distance himself from his radical past, and he did so using the potato as an example. And this is what he recounted in his autobiography. In my household, 5 people and I lived on potatoes. I've seen what no one had seen up to then, what perhaps no one will ever see again, an entire government living in such privation. And I think today we would not think necessarily of potatoes as a mark of deprivation. By virtue of being a favourite food of Republicans, the potato could now be used as a marker for shortage, and thus as a way to demonstrate that political radicalism was bad government. Much political importance was attached to the settlement of food crises. It was not merely a matter of providing the entire country with food, but first and foremost of deciding what counted as food, let alone the quantities that an individual body needed to survive. Lastly, of course, it was far from obvious who was well qualified to decide such matters as the needs of the individual body. Around the country, Republican administrators and popular society struggled to account for food shortages. Some relied on reason. They turned to quantitative measures. They calculated the amount of foodstuffs in a given area. They tried to work out grand schemes for redistributing those food resources. Other groups tried out cultivation programs for substitute foodstuffs endorsed by doctors or chemists. And still others published endless brochures about thrifty use of foodstuffs in the household. Now, interestingly, many such initiatives, as well as the experts who were promoting them, had actually been supported by the government before 1789. But the crises in food supply during the revolution offered all sorts of opportunities for food reformers to come to the government with their direct and sometimes radical contributions to national food policy. After the fall of Robespierre, government views on the ideal diet began to shift. Officials, chemists, and publics began to show more interest in meat than in bread. When food complaints on the streets of Paris began again in January 1794, they were often directed at butchers rather than bakers. And by 1802, a Napoleonic minister could argue that since the revolution, meat has almost become the ordinary food of the people, which was formerly not true. So one's looking with the revolutionary decade at a major shift in the type of diet that was seen as normal for the ordinary population of France. Food riots, on the other hand, were more of a problem that the revolutionary government sought to resolve. Initially, they might have served a useful political purpose. They helped to topple royal rule and they helped to justify revolutionary governments. But after several republican regimes had come and gone, bread marches increasingly appeared a threat to social order. Up until 1794, marchers were seen as having political legitimacy for their grievances, and administrators responded by doing whatever they could to be seen to be addressing problems with the food supply. Later, however, the National Convention applied more repressive measures. It sent in mounted troops to drive the hunger marchers back to their homes, for example, during the so-called hunger insurrection of the 20th of May, 1795. Such interventions by government to stop what had formerly been a sanctioned right of publics generated ironic responses to the whole principle of revolution itself. In August 1795, as the revolutionary anthem, Ça ira, it'll be fine, was being played on the streets of Paris, a man in the crowd called out, "It'll be even finer when you give us our pound of bread." Bitter reproaches were levelled against the government over the price of bread in public spaces. Women threatened to commit suicide along with their entire families if the ration were not increased. If the revolution was embarked upon on a platform of addressing hunger, some eaters felt distinctly cheated, and they respond to attempts at quantification and centralization by recollecting the old political order more charitably. In the spring of 1795, one disaffected citizen wandering down Paris's Rue Jacob was arrested for shouting, "We need a king! Long live the king! If we had a king, at least we'd have bread." Food shortages posed a significant risk to political support for the Republic among ordinary people, as well as to the principle that the popular will ought to be the source of all good government. So I think it's clear from what I've been saying so far that public violence and disorder over food-related issues was certainly not mindless, and it was not about whether it was uncontrollable. Rather, this kind of activity on the part of the public, which in the case of some groups, such as women, was their only way of having any sort of political voice whatsoever, became problematic precisely because up until 1794, it had served as a legitimate premise for challenges to political sovereignty. The problem of food supply could not be resolved by the regimes, and therefore the only alternative was to suppress the expression of popular opinion about food shortages. One of the other responses was that administrators began to pose questions about when food riots could be said to be legitimate. For example, was it okay for publics to riot for sugar or coffee? Were those necessities? Did the French public need meat and was rioting for that legitimate? Did meat, in fact, help to stir people up to commit more acts of violence? And should true Republicans, in fact, prefer vegetables? How indispensable was white bread as opposed to other forms of bread for human health? In other words, was the state obliged to guarantee the supply of all foods for which people rioted? These were essential questions of governance because they had an important bearing on whether food-related bloodshed was to be deemed legitimate or illegitimate, the justifiable outcome of genuine want or mob rule. And I think a lot of these problems about public order still haven't been resolved into our own day. Political attempts to address food shortages faltered partly because practical interventions could only be deemed a success once there was agreement among the scientific and medical practitioners, and also the government about what foods were necessary foods. So to sum things up, what I've been trying to suggest in the course of this talk is that at the heart of the food crises that punctuated the French Revolution, there were profound disagreements over what food was and who controlled both its production and its meaning. Conversely, food could represent the political legitimacy of a regime in multiple different ways. And these concerns absolutely remain with us today. And that's probably why the French Revolution remains a landmark food-related moment in history. On the 14th of July 2011, the British newspaper Daily Mail carried the headline Bastille Day in honour of butchers and murderers. Typically of this tabloid xenophobic stance, the journalists hit out at the French for celebrating the 14th of July as the originary moment of their nation. And I quote, "Today France celebrates its revolution with Bastille Day parades and parties. I reckon that 18th century slaughterfest should merit only a national day of mourning, but the French see it otherwise." The journalist was unaware that she was mobilizing a 200-year-old tradition of the use of butchery metaphors by the right-wing British press, yet again to cast doubt on the political legitimacy of French historiographies of 1789. But the perspective was not wholly alien to French historians themselves. A century earlier, the historian Hippolyte Taine had already asked how, in pursuit of liberty, politicians, legislators, statesmen, and even ministers and heads of government could have ended up in an abattoir, how within the confines of that national butchery, they were by turns slaughterers and cattle. Between 1789 and 1799, the relationship between food and revolution had rather obviously been much more plural than these commentators suggested. The butcher motif would briefly be mobilized in positive ways to denote the revenge of skilled artisans on a cannibalistic government, literally cutting authority down to size. But in appropriating the consuming and ruling role for themselves, Jacobin leaders attracted charges of cannibalism in their turn. Where Jacobins had attacked calculating and tyrannical old regime vampires, the revolution's opponents levelled charges of irrational, bloodthirsty violence against ordinary people protesting in city streets and the legislators who represented them. Yet the problem of hunger remained. Scientific accounts of the proper diet for human bodies were not stable. Government policies for managing the food supply shifted between promoting frugality and a plant-based diet as more natural to the French, and representing meat as essential to national well-being and public order. And this dialectic, which cast the French by turns as vegetarians or carnivores, eaters or prey, also is one that you find overseas in British caricatures of the French Revolution. So in short, historians can never afford to understand hunger as a mere biological urge when it comes to the French Revolution, because to do so is to take sides with just one of many groups of different kinds of eaters who made the revolution. So I think now we can move to the questions, if there are any questions. I'll keep the slideshow up in case people want to refer back to a particular slide.
Thanks, Emma. That was really interesting. A few questions have come up as you've been talking. Not loads so far. The first one, someone wants to know whether you'd consider the revolutionaries' destruction of church records as indicative of tolerance for such amoral butchers, given religion's connection to monarchy and morality.
To such amoral
butchers.
Butchers.
Yeah.
Why church records in particular, I suppose I would ask.
I don't know. There's not more information.
Perhaps if the person who posed the question could amplify a little bit in the chat there. Shall we move on to the second question,
Yes.
and we'll come back to that one?
That sounds good. Right. So the next one is, why do you think the British monarchy has managed to survive despite being equally tyrannical at the time?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I think the answer to it lies in the fact that by this date, the British monarchy had comparatively little power. There was no absolutist government, and quite a lot of what was going on in terms of policy and its implementation was attributed to the actions of Parliament. So a lot of critique came down on parliamentarians, but that didn't really have an effect upon the monarchy as such, because the monarchy had to support both parliamentary sides. So, for example, if one party was seen to support policies that had made people suffer from food shortages, then the solution was to support the other party rather than to try and bring down the monarch. Now, this is not to say that there wasn't the same equation going on in Britain, namely the king was seen as the nourisher of the people. So you have Farmer George, for example. So all of these monarchs are very alike in their interests in supporting the food supply through the pursuit of the sciences. But only in France did this lead to a setup where policy became a really big problem with which the monarch couldn't solve. And therefore, there are all kinds of direct difficulties for the monarchy rather than for the government as such.
This is this is another cool question. Do you think these cannibalistic attitudes aided the development of Gothic vampirism?
Yes, slightly indirectly, because at this point, of course, people were drawing on an approximately 60-year-old tradition of literary vampirism. It starts in Vienna in the Habsburg Empire in the late 1720s, when cases of vampirism are reported to Vienna, and they circulate from there in print to the rest of Europe and cause a huge sensation. And that's another story which I won't go into. But what's interesting is that by the later 1780s, so 60 years later, you've got this big vocabulary of cannibalism. And you've got ways in which that vocabulary can be usefully turned to political ends. But I think that it takes on its modern form as a very serious mark of political conflict and illegitimacy, really thanks to the French Revolution. And when you look at, say, 19th century vampire tales, there are lots of vestiges of that in 19th century vampire tales, the sort of notion that somehow blood sucking is going to be associated with people who are politically undesirable, not just as it were, physiologically different, but also politically problematic. So I think it does acquire a very intense political flavor during the 1790s.
This next, I think I might just read this whole question out, because I think it's otherwise I'm going to say something wrong. So Rousseau is routinely thought of as a philosopher whose work inspired and contributed to the ideas of the French Revolution. But this person also is led to believe that he was an advocate for vegetarianism and he critiqued meat eating. Were these ideas of Rousseau's ignored by the revolutionaries, or was there apparent fixation on meat mere propaganda?
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting and astute question there. Indeed, he was an advocate for vegetarianism. He was actually the main source for the vegetarian movement that I very briefly mentioned in the talk. And that vegetarian movement, interestingly, particularly takes root among the nobility. That's where you mostly find people who are supporters of vegetarianism. And it's particularly common, interestingly enough, among military nobles, who you would have thought would have had to be more bloodthirsty. But no, there are lots of military nobles who embraced vegetarianism in the 1780s, in the run-up to the French Revolution itself. And of course, one has to remember, as William Doyle has shown us, that actually nobles were very important in bringing about the early stages of the revolution. They're very, very heavily involved in revolutionary activity. So, for example, Lafayette, who becomes the new governor of Paris, he's fought in the American wars. He comes back and he's one of this cohort of reforming military nobles that to which these vegetarians also belong to a very great extent. Rousseau was a very multidimensional author, and a lot of what he said and wrote was taken up differently by different groups. So pretty much every educated person read Rousseau before the revolution and took something out of Rousseau, but not all of them then became Republicans. And I think that's important to stress, because it means that, you know, you could sort of pick and choose out of Rousseau's comments as to what you held to be most important. So in what I was talking about just now, it's quite clear that some of these really radical Jacobins who are saying that a good Republican should only eat the foods that nature provides, that's coming directly out of Rousseau. But the ones who are supporting meat eating can still, in a sense, be supporting Rousseau's political principles and be supportive of a republic, but perhaps just not pick up on the dietary aspect. So he's a very, you know, he serves many sides. It's like the Bible, you know, the Bible being used for a really wide range of different purposes.
So this question is asking, to what extent was the monarchy culpable, or the monarch culpable, or was he merely a necessary scapegoat?
For the ills of the old regime?
I assume so.
Yeah, well, I'll assume that you mean that, dear viewer, unless you correct me in the chat there. But so this is a very interesting question. So the historiography on Louis XVI is really very imperfect at the moment. Almost all of it tends to go along with the view that the king was weak and that he didn't really have any positive agendas of his own, and that essentially he simply mishandled the revolution, which he should have put down more firmly. And that's quite an interesting view, really, because actually, if we look at what Louis was doing in his short rule of 16 years, he was pretty active. As I said, he introduced the proposal for liberalizing the grain trade. He introduced all kinds of reforms. He built hospitals. He supported lots and lots of scientific practitioners in finding solutions to food shortages and other kinds of social problems. There's every reason to believe that he was actually quite a strongly reforming monarch, and that's how he presents himself really from early on, even before he accedes to the throne. And so from that point of view, he definitely did have an agenda, and his agenda, therefore, if we see him as a reformer, it probably also included many of the early sorts of reforms that the revolutionaries embarked upon in 1789 and 1790. So what I think that one could say he was is someone who got caught in the crosshairs. That is to say, he continued to hold that he could remain as the monarch of a constitutional nation, but he continued to believe that he was able to maintain the veto. And the whole thing fell apart, really, when he refused to give up the veto. And from that point of view, it's really the moment when public opinion towards him changed was at the flight to Varennes, which presumably he undertook principally under the urging of Marie Antoinette and her contacts. And after all, it was Marie Antoinette's brother who was across the border waiting to receive them and conduct them to safekeeping. So I think that Louis was a person in a very difficult position with, as it were, aims and plans for improving the nation. But the situation took a series of unexpected turns. And in the final analysis, he then found himself without the right kind of ability to row back. He'd lost control of his own bodyguard. It had been replaced with the National Guard. He agreed to try to flee the country and lost all of his legitimacy. So it's a series of decisions which aren't really about a weak person, but somebody who dealt with individual events that no one could really have foreseen, and no one did foresee.
And this is a much more general question, but someone's just asking if there are any recommendations for books or further reading around these topics.
I'm afraid the first part of your comment was lost. You sort of froze a bit, Will, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry. They're just asking for further recommendations for reading yeah, books, resources in general.
On the French Revolution.
On these topics, yeah.
Or this particular topic. Well, I've published a book in 2014 called Feeding France, which does talk quite a lot about the potato in the Republican period and other kinds of industrial activities. And this particular talk has just recently come out as a chapter in a book called Life in Revolutionary France, edited by Bloomsbury, published by Bloomsbury. So that just came out a couple of months ago. In terms of, there's not a lot more, as I mentioned at the start, that deals with food and diet, but there's a very large number of really interesting works on cultural history of France in the late 18th century. And I strongly recommend authors like Colin Jones, William Doyle, Sarah Marza, for example, and there's less, I think, on, there's people like Marisa Linton on the Terror, but there's less on the later 1790s still. That's really recommendable. I hope that starts a little bit, but there's so much. Sorry.
Are there a lot of primary sources that people could have a look at as well, just sort of like freely available?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it depends if you read French. There are huge numbers of digitized pamphlets that you can access. For example, Ball State University has the most amazing collection of French Revolutionary pamphlets. There's also a website run by Stanford University Press that offers images, for example, images of the French Revolution. Most of the ones I used in this talk came from Gallica, which is the equivalent of the British Library online service. Now, in terms of translated materials, that is a lot rarer, and it frustrates me all the time that there isn't more material from this period that has been translated, but you can find obvious things like the Declaration of the Rights of Man, some of the more famous speeches, and there's also an edited collection by Lynn Hunt, which contains extracts, no more than extracts really, from a variety of French revolutionary sources that it's very interesting to have a look at. But really the trouble is the volume of all this, because the number of pamphlets runs into the thousands. And so even if you look at an entire volume of extracts and translations, you're going to get only the thinnest sense of what this material consists of in total.
I think we'll probably have to stop with the questions now because we're running the optional Q&A. Emma, are you staying for that, or is it just our student?
I am staying, yes.
Okay, cool. I mean, in that case, maybe we should just work for a few more of these as well, and then if people want to ask more general questions, then they can. I haven't seen any yet, but yeah, just to say to the remainder of you who are in the session, if you would like to ask questions that are slightly more general than the talk or just about the talk, obviously, feel free to now. Yeah, so I'll keep going through some of these. Sorry, 1 second.
That's all right.
Okay. Do you think modern day radical slogans such as "Eat the Rich" have inspiration from French revolutionary cannibalistic imagery?
That's an excellent suggestion. It's very possible. The thing is that historically speaking, it would be almost impossible to prove, because this is one of those situations where one is dealing with oral transmission of how to run a protest. And it's certainly the case that if you look at various sorts of political crises over the last couple of centuries since the French Revolution, similar themes do recur over and over again. I mean, the question of what counts as a good diet comes up over and over again every time there's a major war. So in World War I, World War II, there's lots and lots of writing at those points about what counts as the right diet. Similarly, with this kind of debate about who's feeding on whom, to give you one example, when anti-Semitists sought to disparage the Jews in pre-World War II Germany, one of the ways that they did so was to represent the Jews as vampires who are feeding on the people. And so that's obviously, got quite close links to the ways in which these sort of metaphors of vampirism are being invoked in the French Revolution.
And slightly more general question, or very general question now, is do we still see the effects of the French Revolution today? I don't know how you want to answer that, but
that is a very general question. Well, I mean, in the sense that Francois Furet, in his most famous book, Interpreting the French Revolution, starts by saying the French Revolution is not over. And by that he means that it's still the subject of enormous debate. Was that a...
I think there was just a static.
Oh, it's just echo. Okay. No, what by that he means that essentially the French Revolution continues to provoke debate among historians, precisely because historians come from left and right wings of politics, and those two wings have never been reconciled and in their aims, and therefore they've also never been reconciled as to what the revolution means. So there's a kind of feedback loop, if you like. The French Revolution serves all kinds of purposes still to this day. I mean, you just saw now with a very right-wing newspaper, the Daily Mail, saying, actually, why would one celebrate the birth of a nation by looking at these people who murdered other people? So in a way, you can recycle the French Revolution in a variety of ways to serve different political purposes up to the present day. It has structural effects besides these effects as a metaphor. It has structural effects in that quite a lot of governments formed in the 19th century that rested on popular voting or even just middle-class voting tended to borrow elements from the new French governments. Although it has to be said that really many of those are features from the Napoleonic government, because that was considered to be somewhat more stable than the regimes that had preceded it. So there are different ways in which we could answer that question, I think. But yes, I think there is lots of interesting ways of drawing lines between what was happening here and what happens today.
I think I might be missing something in this question, because I think it might be just implicit in what you sort of been saying, but it's do you think the memory of the narratives of foodstuffs can be an important way to study history, especially in times of uprising?
I hope the talk has suggested that the answer to that is yes, very much so. I mean, I think it's really an underplayed area. And there are all sorts of ways in which we can see, how that might work for other foodstuffs, although you have to look at, chronologically specific foods. And we can see that certain foods come to take on a significance much, much greater than themselves. They become what I've called iconic foods in the talk. That is to say that there's a lot of depiction of them, there's a lot of interest in what they mean, where they come from, how you process them. They're attributed all kinds of really significant attributes or amazing effects, and that picture changes all the time. So the map of the foods that are to be considered of interest changes all the time. And amazingly enough, in my childhood, nobody had ever heard of kiwi fruit, for example. Right, and now we have kiwi fruit, which are really the berries of a Chinese plant, which have been adopted by New Zealanders as a significant substance, and now we eat them all the time. Tell me the last time you had a fruit salad that didn't have a slice of kiwi fruit in, right? So there are ways of looking at this and picking up interesting discussions about particular individual foodstuffs. And we have to understand that it's a historically changing picture. And in order to know what a particular foodstuff means, we have to follow it in a particular culture and look at the debates that are going on there, which is why there is one genre of food history that's a bit problematic, which simply says, oh, the chili arrived in Europe in such and such a date and it's been there ever since. Well, in a sense, yes, maybe the plant's been there, maybe the material thing has been there, but the meanings will have changed really dramatically over time, and historians need to be sort of paying attention to what those meanings are and how very differently a substance can register under different circumstances.
Do you think that we still see the authorities today as the providers of the nourishment? Is this beneficial or problematic?
I think absolutely yes, right? Because imagine a situation in which there are food shortages, then the blame almost always falls on whoever's in government at the time. So that having extended food shortages is seen as a really worrying thing to by almost any government. So there is a kind of continued tacit moral consensus about the status of the government as securing the proper functioning of the food supply. I've now forgotten what the second part of that was.
Sorry,
my dog's now barking as well.
Sorry, I went off at myself. It's somehow I've lost it as well. Sorry. Maybe we can come back to that. It seems to have vanished. Maybe I clicked it was answered. Oh yeah, is this beneficial or problematic? Was the last part of that?
I think it's almost unavoidable, actually, and I think that it probably depends on where you stand and what perspective you're looking at it from. I should imagine that it is actually something that's perceived as very problematic by governments, but also unavoidable. It's true that nowadays there are also a lot of attempts to make sure that it's the supermarkets that bear the blame. So, for example, with the shortages that occurred during the first of the lockdowns and since Brexit, there have been a lot of complaints about individual supermarkets, which is actually quite interesting. I guess the question is really, when a shortage occurs, where should the blame properly land? Is it down to political factors, or is it down to food supply factors that are commercially determined? So I think that it's not really possible to judge except in individual cases where that, where that should go, that sort of sense that somebody should be responsible. But it is a major problem. I mean, it's an increasing problem because our societies are so much more structured and our food chains are so much more complex, and we eat so many more things than we used to that come from further away. So obviously there's much more risk for food supplies to be disrupted. So yes, I think it's an important issue.
I'll just answer this question. Someone's just asking how they can access recordings of the sessions if they've missed something earlier. I think we're aiming, as long as everything's sort of okay, we're probably aiming to put them up on YouTube at some point. So if they do go up, that would be the place to look. Okay,
should we move to, I wonder if we should move to the more general, I'm conscious that time is getting on.
Oh, you know what? There is a general admissions question that we could answer. Okay. I've only seen one so far as the issue.
Okay, right.
No, I've been keeping an eye out. It's just they haven't seemed to be coming in. So I'll quickly say again that if you would like to ask anything of our student volunteers or just general admissions questions, now is also a good time to do so. So this question is, because there were no at-interview history assessments at Corpus Christi, do the other factors, so personal statements, school references, academic records, have a greater weight in the application? If so, which of those factors are weighted more, or are they equal?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. We have in some years had at-interview assessments, but things have been changed quite a lot by the situation with the pandemic for obvious reasons, so it's not been possible. I would say that out of all of the materials that you submit to us, the ones which we look at for longest and pay most attention to in terms of making our decisions are the pieces of submitted work. And that means that when you're thinking about what to submit, you should choose pieces that represent your best work, obviously, but also that represent your range of abilities. So don't just, send us 2 essays on Jenkins' ear or whatever, but think about a bit of a diversity in what you cover, simply because the Cambridge history tripos is itself really quite diverse. So it's quite useful to know, for us to know and for you to know, whether that sort of diversity of approaches will be suitable for you, right? Other than that, your personal statement is really important. Please be aware that we will ask questions about the content of your personal statement. So, don't just bung something in and hope for the best, because you'll probably be asked about it. What teachers say that is somewhat less important in terms of the fact that we take it into account, but it's kind of lower in the ranking because every school is very, very different in the way that they write about students. And so therefore, just for the purposes of equity, we pay more attention to what you say about yourself, as it were. Obviously, you don't want your teachers saying, "Oh, absolutely awful, don't want to take that person," but they never say that anyway, so be reassured. But I think that the main thing is really that you should be able to explain to us why you're a good historian, why you feel passionate about it, and what you think attracts you about the course and the range of options that you could possibly follow and take.
I recognise this question from earlier. I don't think we've got time to answer it. Is it worth mentioning historical fiction in our personal statement, or is that not taken seriously?
I think it can be taken seriously. It sort of depends what. If you say, well, I get all my knowledge of history from historical fiction, that might not be such a good look. But I think if you were to say such and such a source had particularly interested you and led you to look further into history, then that's obviously something that is very welcome.
This is a good question. How can we be practicing university history skills now?
Yes, very good question. Well, I would say read widely and critically. Try to read some shorter texts on historiography, the sort of things like What is History Now, Canadine, Jenkins. There's a lot of little primers out there that aren't very expensive, and you can often get them secondhand as well for virtually nothing. And just getting a sense of what kinds of historiographical approaches are out there and how you might engage with those can be really, really useful to you in preparation for taking a course like this, where you have to think about these things very hard. And once you arrive at the university, you often don't have a lot of time to go back and do that sort of reading, right? So I'd strongly recommend that sort of material. The other thing is to look at some of the classic and famous works of history, because having some sense of those or knowledge about those is also something that works very well in interviews. And it's something that will enrich your knowledge of the field, and you'll find that you fall back on it over and over again as you progress through the 3 years of your degree. And that applies anywhere, not just Cambridge, but whichever university you end up going to. Okay.
As a related thing, I've just posted a link in the chat to the book token competition that we're running. Actually, that's something that students may be able to enter, where you can sort of win about £250 worth of books, sort of, whatever sort of academic books you'd like to buy. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that as well.
Sorry, can I just jump in with another recommendation for general historiographical stuff? I think it was actually on the recommended list when I was going into first year, but A Concise Companion to History, for anyone that's kind of looking for a thematic approach. It kind of divides it into public history, gender history, political history. I found that really useful in sort of prepping for university type historiographical reading.
Thanks, Isabel. I mean, there are quite a number. I can't think, do we ever make such a list available to people in advance, or do we have it on the website anywhere? Because we do have a list, and it might be sensible to just sort of put it up somewhere, really.
Yes, let me have a look. I mean, there are various reading lists for prospective students in history that sort of are related to Cambridge. I forget if we have one specifically. I think if anyone who wants to have a look at those things, I mean, if you literally type in, as I've just frantically done now, history, prospective, well, I've typed it in very strangely, but prospective applicant history reading list Cambridge, you'll get the King's College one, you'll get some various ones from the Faculty of History as well. There are quite a few to have a browse of. Yeah, it's probably worth checking if we have ours on the website as well.
I think that, yes, that would be a very good idea. Will, I think at this point, I'm bowing out to let Isabel and George have a go, so that people can ask the questions they really want to know the answer to, rather than just the things I can talk to them about. So thank you all very much for spending time looking at my slides, and I hope you come and apply to us. It would be lovely. We look forward to seeing you.